The wind came screaming across the frozen dark, and somewhere out in that white, roaring storm, a child was dying. 3 figures fought through the snow, half blind, half frozen, a small burning body clutched between them. Behind them, their fire had gone black. Their home had surrendered to the cold. Ahead, only one light, one window, glowing soft and golden at the far edge of a buried town. The one house everyone had laughed at. The one woman they had called mad. The one wall they swore would fail. It was the last warm place left in all that frozen country. And a small life now hung on whether a fool's strange secret would hold. The whole settlement had mocked her. Tonight, the cold would finally decide who was right. And it was coming for them all. The wind came first. It always came first, long before the cold ever showed its face. Out on that high, open country, where the land ran flat and endless toward a horizon that never seemed to come any closer, the wind moved low across the frozen grass. It pressed against every wall. It searched every seam and every joint of every small house scattered along the creek bed. It did not howl, not yet. It simply leaned, patient and certain, the way something leans when it knows it has all night to win. By dusk, the little settlement had gone quiet, a scattering of homesteads, a frozen ribbon of creek. A handful of families behind a handful of doors, each of them feeding a fire as fast as their hands could move. From every rooftop rose a thick column of smoke, gray and white against a darkening sky, all of it bending hard to one side in the wind. That smoke told a story to anyone who knew how to read it. It meant fear. It meant men and women kneeling at their hearths, pushing log after log into the flames, watching their woodpiles shrink, doing the only thing they knew how to do against a cold that did not care how hard they tried. Every rooftop told that same desperate story. Every rooftop but one. At the far edge of the settlement, set a little apart behind a low rise of earth and a thin row of planted trees, stood one small cabin, and from its chimney rose almost nothing at all, just a faint thread of smoke, so thin you might have missed it. So gentle it seemed the fire inside had nearly died. And yet, the windows of that cabin glowed, not the frantic orange of a fire pushed to its limit, but a steady golden amber, the color of warmth that costs no struggle to keep. The kind of light that seems to say, "Come in, sit down, stay a while. You are safe here." A traveler crossing that ridge in the failing light might have stopped his horse and stared. Every other home burning through its winter like a candle held to a storm. And this one, quiet, sparing, unbothered. He might have wondered what kind of woman lived inside those walls. He might have wondered what she knew, that no one else did. Because the answer was not luck. It was not some gift the cold had decided to grant her, and no one else. What lived inside those walls was something she had built with her own 2 hands through long and lonely weeks, while the whole settlement laughed behind her back and called her foolish. By the end of that winter, they would call her something else entirely. But to understand what she made, you first have to understand what she had lost. So let the wind fall still for a moment. Let the snow melt back into the ground and go back to the spring. She came to that country the way the broken come to anything, quietly and without much hope. A single wagon, a tired horse, A few crates of belongings lashed down with rope worn soft from handling, and a woman of 34 sitting straight on the bench, reins loose in her hands, her eyes fixed on a horizon that gave her nothing to look at but more of itself. The road there had been a long one, day after day of the same flat country unrolling before her, the same wind, the same enormous sky that made a person feel like the last living thing left in the world. At night, she would make a small fire by the wagon and sit beside it and eat without tasting much of anything. And the dark would come down so complete and so wide that the stars looked close enough to touch. There was no one to talk to. There had been no one for a long while now. And the strangest thing, she thought, on those nights, was how quickly a person gets used to the sound of her own silence. The land out there did not welcome people. It tolerated them. It stretched out flat and gray-green and immense, the grass rippling in the wind like the surface of a sea that had forgotten how to make waves. No trees worth the name, no shelter, just sky and grass and that endless, searching wind. It was a place a person came to when there was nowhere left to go back to, and there was nowhere left for her. She had buried a husband. That was the simplest way to say it, and the cruelest, and she had learned to say it plainly, because saying it any softer only made the wound take longer to close. He had been a gentleman, a man who hummed without knowing he was doing it, a man who could fix anything that broke and never once raised his voice about the things that couldn't be fixed. They had built a small life together, in a small house, far to the east of this empty country. And it had been enough, more than enough. She remembered the smallest things about him. That was the cruelty of it. Not the big things, the wedding day or the promises, but the small ones, the ones that ambushed her when she least expected. The way, on cold evenings, he would take her hands between his two big warm ones and hold them there without a word until the chill went out of her fingers. He never made anything of it. He just did it, as if keeping her warm were the most natural thing in the world, a small daily task that belonged to him and no one else. She had not known then what a gift that was. You never do. Not while it's still being given. Then the fever came. It came in the deep of a winter so cold the nails groaned in the walls. It settled into his chest, and it would not leave. And she had done everything. She had done every single thing a person can do. She had fed the fire until her arms ached. She had burned the kindling, and then the spare boards, and then, on the worst night of all, when the cold pressed against the windows like a living thing trying to get in, she had broken apart the last good chair in the house and fed that to the flames too. She had knelt by the bed and held his hand and watched the fire burn down anyway. And near the end, when he could barely speak, he had done a thing she would carry to her own grave. He had taken her cold hands and tried with the last of his strength to warm them between his. But there was no warmth left in him to give, because here was the thing she could never forget. Here was the thing that followed her west, across all those miles of empty grass. No matter how much wood she burned, the cold still reached him. The walls would not hold the warmth. The heat poured up the chimney and out through the cracks and away into the night, and the room grew colder by the hour. and she had not been able to keep him warm. She had not been able to keep him. He slipped away before morning. And when the sun finally rose, it rose on a house full of cold ash and a silence so complete it had a sound of its own. That was the winter that taught her what cold could take, and that was the winter she carried with her, like a stone sewn into the lining of her coat, when she finally turned the wagon west and went looking for a place to start again. She did not arrive empty-handed, though. Whatever the fever had taken, it had not taken her hands. Her father had been a builder, a patient, particular man who worked in wood the way some people pray, slowly and with great care, and a deep respect for the thing in front of him. As a girl, she had sat in the corner of his workshop for hours, breathing in the clean smell of fresh-cut pine and curling shavings, watching his hands move. She could close her eyes, even now, and be back there. The slant of afternoon light through the one dusty window, the soft hiss of the plane, the little drifts of shavings that gathered around his boots like pale curls of snow that never melted. He taught her to listen to wood. That was how he put it. Listen to it. She remembered the first time. She could not have been more than 6 or 7. He had set her small hand flat on a rough plank and laid his big hand over it and gone very still. "Feel that?" he had murmured. "That's the grain. That's the way it grew." Every board remembers the tree it came from, remembers which way it reached for the sun, where the wind pushed on it, where it had to grow strong to keep from breaking. She had not understood. Not really. But she had felt something. A direction. A kind of life still sleeping in the dead wood. Wood remembers everything that ever happened to it, her father said. You learn to listen, and it'll tell you. Where it's strong. Where it'll split. What it wants to do. If you let it. He would lay his palm against a board and go quiet, the way other men went quiet in church. And then he would tell her which way the grain ran, where it was strong, where it would crack if you pushed it wrong. People laughed at that sometimes. A man talking to lumber, but her father built things that lasted, things that stood straight long after other men's work had sagged and split and surrendered. And the laughter never seemed to bother him at all. So she had grown up with sawdust under her nails and a square and a chisel that fit her hand like they had been made for it. She knew joints and notches and the slow, honest math of how a thing holds itself up against the pull of the world. It was not common. A woman who could build. She knew that. She had felt the surprise on people's faces her whole life, but it was hers. It was the one thing the fever could not reach, and it was the only thing she had left to bring to that empty, wind-scoured country. Besides her grief, and a little money sewn carefully into the hem of her dress, and a stubbornness she did not yet know the full size of, the settlement, when she reached it, was barely a settlement at all, a loose handful of cabins flung out across the prairie like seeds from a careless hand, a frozen creek that thawed in spring into something brown and grudging, a scatter of families, each one fighting the same long fight against the same long winters, each one too tired and too far apart to do much fighting together. There was a single store at the center of it, if you could call it a center, a low building of weathered boards where a man sold flour and nails and lamp oil and 100 small necessities, and where the talk of the settlement gathered the way water gathers in a low place. A few faces she came to know by sight, a stooped old man who sat by the stove most days and said little, a sharp-eyed woman who missed nothing and forgot less. They were not unkind, the people there, but they were guarded. The land made them that way. You could see it in how they measured a stranger. Slowly, from a distance, the way you'd measure a coming storm. A widow, alone, with no man and no children, and her own tools in the wagon bed. That gave them plenty to measure. The nearest neighbor was a man named Reuben Stagg, who farmed the claim just over the rise. A big, slow-moving man with a soft heart hidden behind a hard face, the kind of man who would never offer help, but would somehow always be there when help was needed. He brought her a sack of seed potatoes that first week and set it on her step and left before she could thank him. That was how things were done out there. Kindness, but sideways. Generosity that wore the mask of minding its own business. She took the claim at the far edge of the settlement, the one set behind that low rise of earth, the one the others had passed over because it sat a little exposed to the worst of the wind. There was a cabin on it already, a poor thing, hastily built by whoever had given up before her. A single room, a roof that let in light at the corners, walls of logs notched and stacked and packed with mud that had already begun to crack and fall away. A two-season house, that was the name the honest builders gave to such places. Fine in spring, fine in summer, just bearable in fall, and in winter, a slow trap, closing. That first night, she did not bother to unpack much. She built a small fire, and she sat before it on an upturned crate, and she listened to the wind find its way through the walls of her new home, whispering at the corners, sliding cold fingers across the floor. Outside, the dark was absolute. No lamp of any neighbor close enough to see. Just her and the fire and the great indifferent country pressing in on every side. She had thought, somewhere in the back of her mind, that distance might help, that if she went far enough, the grief might lose her trail. It had not. It had ridden west with her the whole way, patient as the wind. She walked the inside of the cabin that first evening, running her hands along the logs, pressing her palm flat against the wood the way her father had taught her. And what she felt there made something tighten in her chest. The walls were already cold. Not winter cold. It was spring and mild. But the cold was in them all the same, waiting. The way it waits in everything that cannot hold the warmth. She stood a long time in that little room, with her hand against the wall, and she thought about a fire burning down in the dark, and a hand growing cold in hers, and a house full of ash. She did not cry. She had done her crying. She just stood there, listening to the wall, and somewhere underneath the grief, very quietly, a question began to take shape. The settlement had made its peace with the cold long ago. That was the thing she noticed first, once the spring warmed and she began, slowly, to move among her neighbors and learn the shape of their lives. They did not fight the winter the way you fight something you believe you can beat. They endured it, the way you endure weather, or age, or grief, as a fact, as a thing that simply was, and always would be, and could not be argued with. When the talk turned to the cold months, and it always did, you could hear it in their voices. A flat, worn resignation. The older ones especially. They spoke of winter the way you speak of an old enemy you have stopped hoping to defeat. You burned more wood. You slept closer to the fire. You wore your coat indoors, and you put the children nearest the stove, and you got up in the black middle of the night to feed the flames, and you did it again the next night and the next. And in the spring, if you were lucky, you were all still alive to complain about it. That was winter. That was just what winter meant. She would never forget one thing she saw that first spring, before the cold ever came. A neighbor's child, small and thin, standing in a doorway in the morning chill, hugging itself, its little teeth chattering, waiting for the fire inside to catch and the room to warm, and the mother, harried and tired, telling the child to stop its fussing, that this was nothing, that come January it would learn what cold really meant. The child had nodded, solemn, and tried to stop shivering, and something in the widow had gone very quiet and very hard at the sight of it, because she knew what January meant in a house that could not hold its warmth. And the thought of that small body shivering through it, learning to call suffering ordinary, it would not leave her. And the wood. She heard about the wood from everyone. The nearest trees worth cutting stood miles away, across rough and rutted ground, down by the breaks where the land finally dipped toward water. And every autumn the whole settlement gave itself over to the hauling of it, days and days of it, wagons groaning under split logs, wheels sinking to the axle in the autumn mud, horses straining, men cursing, the cold already breathing down their necks. They hauled all that wood. They split it and stacked it into great walls beside their doors. And it was never enough. She heard the stories told flat and grim, the way people tell the things that frighten them, of winters when the wood ran out in the dead of the cold, of families burning their furniture by midwinter, of the worst seasons when folks tore the boards from their own inner walls and fed them to the stove just to live to see the thaw. She listened to all of it, and every time that stone sewn into the lining of her coat grew a little heavier, because she knew that cold. She had knelt in front of it. She had broken a chair apart in the dark and fed it to a fire that could not save the only person she had left. The others spoke of the wood running short, but she kept turning the problem over late at night by the light of a single candle, and she kept arriving at a different question altogether, a question none of them seemed to be asking. It was not, she thought, only that they had too little wood. It was that the wood they burned did so little good. So she began to watch. That was all, at first. She simply watched. And she watched in a way that her neighbors found, frankly, peculiar. On cold mornings, when the frost still clung to the grass and the smoke hung low over the rooftops, she would walk out among the cabins of the settlement, and she would lay her bare palm flat against the outside of other people's walls. She felt for the warm places and the cold places. She marked where the frost melted first in the morning sun, and where it clung longest in the shadow. She watched how the cold gathered in the corners and pooled there like water finding the low ground. She watched the smoke, too, how fast it poured from each chimney, how the houses that burned the most wood were not always the warmest, and how some small, tight cabin with a careful fire could hold its heat better than a big one with a roaring blaze and a dozen gaps in its walls. She was building something in her mind, a picture, a map of where the warmth went and how and why. People saw her doing it. They did not understand. A grown woman walking the settlement at dawn with her hand pressed to the logs of a house that was not hers. Her head tilted, her eyes half closed, as if she were listening to something only she could hear. Reuben Stagg found her one morning standing inside the unfinished cavity of her own wall, her ear pressed flat against the wood, utterly still. He stood there a long moment before he spoke. "What in the world are you doing?" he asked, more puzzled than unkind. She did not move right away. When she finally answered, her voice was quiet and far away. "Trying to understand," she said, "what the wall does with the warmth after the fire dies." Reuben Stagg looked at her for a while. Then he nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he has decided not to ask any more questions. And he walked back over the rise toward his own claim, thinking, kindly, that the poor woman had spent too many months alone with her grief. But she was not lost. She was paying attention, closer attention than anyone in that whole settlement had ever paid to anything. She learned things those mornings, with her palm against the cold wood. She learned that the outside of a wall on a heated house is never quite as cold as the open air. That somehow, slowly, a little of the warmth from inside crept all the way through the logs and reached the outer surface, where the wind stole it away. The heat was leaving. She could feel it leaving, with her own hand, the warmth bleeding out through the wood and into the night and gone. That was the trap. That was the whole cruel trap the entire settlement was caught in, and had been caught in for years. A wall of logs, however carefully built, however tightly packed with mud and grass, could only do so much to slow the warmth from escaping. Build a great fire, and the heat poured in faster than the wall could lose it, and the room grew warm. But let that fire sink low. Let the flames drop below a certain point, and the wall simply gave up. It stopped holding back the cold and started welcoming it in, drinking the warmth out of the room as fast as the dying fire could make it. More fire meant more wood. More wood meant more hauling, more hands worn raw, more days lost to that endless trail down to the breaks and back. And still, by the cold hour before dawn, the cabin would be near as cold inside as out. She understood it now, not in the vague, tired way the others understood it. She understood it the way her father had understood a board, with her hands, in her bones, all the way through. And one evening, she did a small thing that told her everything. She lit a candle, and she carried it slowly along the bottom of her own walls, down low where the floor met the logs. And she watched the flame. It bent. Down near the floorboards, the little flame leaned and shivered, pulled sideways by drafts she could not feel on her skin, but the candle could not hide. Cold air, sliding in through cracks and joints, creeping across the floor like something alive. She moved the candle higher, and the flame steadied. Lower, and it bent again. She knelt there in the dim room, watching that small flame tell her the truth, and something settled inside her. A cold, clear certainty. The cold was not just coming through the walls. It was moving. It was flowing. It came in low and slid across the floor and pushed the warm air up and out, around and around. A slow, endless circle that no fire could ever fill, because the warmth was leaving as fast as the fire could make it. You could not win that fight by burning more. You could burn the whole prairie, and you would not win it. She blew out the candle and sat in the dark. And there, in the dark, the question finished forming itself at last. For her whole life among these people, and for all the years of these people before her, everyone had asked the same thing when the cold came. The very same thing she had asked, kneeling beside a dying fire in a house far to the east. How do we make more heat, more wood, more fire, more hauling, more aching arms, more nights without sleep, more, against a cold that took it all and gave nothing back? But sitting there in the dark of that poor little cabin, with the wind beginning its low, patient lean against the walls, she turned the question over, and finally set it down the other way around. What if the question was wrong? What if the answer was not more heat at all? What if the real question, the only question that mattered, was how to keep the warmth they already had, not to make more, to hold what was made, to build a wall that did not surrender the heat the moment the fire sank low, a wall that took the warmth in, slowly, all through the burning hours, and then gave it back, just as slowly, through the long, cold dark. A wall that remembered the fire, long after the fire was gone. And there, in the dark, her father's voice came back to her, soft as the hiss of his plane. Wood remembers everything that ever happened to it. She did not yet know how, not exactly, but the shape of it was there now, glowing faintly in her mind like the amber light in a window. And she thought of her father, with his palm flat against a board, telling her to listen. She thought of a chair broken apart in the dark, fed to a fire that could not save what mattered. And she thought, very quietly, with the first warmth she had felt in a long, long time, maybe it had not been her fault. Maybe she had simply been fighting the wrong fight. The way they were all fighting the wrong fight. The way everyone always had. She sat there a long while in the dark, with the wind leaning against the walls, and then, slowly, she smiled, because for the first time since she had buried the gentlest man she ever knew, she had something to build, and the cold, at long last, had something to fear. The idea did not come to her all at once. It came the way the best ideas come, slowly, in pieces, in the quiet hours when the rest of the world is asleep and a mind is finally free to wander where it likes. She would sit by her small fire in the evenings, watching the flames, and she would think about the wood. There was wood everywhere in this fight. Wood in the walls, wood in the woodpile, wood feeding the fire, and wood being hauled across miles of broken ground until the horses dropped from it. And it struck her, one night, that the settlement only ever thought of wood in two ways. Wood you stacked outside, which did nothing but wait, and weather, and slowly rot in the rain, and wood you burned, which gave up all its warmth in a rush of flame and then was gone forever, the heat racing up the chimney into the empty sky. Two ways, only ever two. But there was a third way. She could feel it, just beyond the edge of her thoughts, the way you can feel a word you cannot quite remember. What if the wood did not have to burn to give its warmth? She thought about a stone left too near the hearth, how it grew warm slowly all through the evening, and how, hours later, long after the fire had died, you could still press your hand to that stone and feel the heat held inside it, leaking out into the cold room. She thought about how the great flat rocks down by the creek stayed warm into the night long after the sun had set. She thought, too, of a thing from her childhood she had not remembered in years. Her mother, on bitter nights, warming a smooth stone by the fire and wrapping it in flannel and tucking it down at the foot of the bed. How that stone would hold its heat for hours. A small, faithful warmth against your feet long after the house had gone cold and dark. A warm stone in a cold bed. That was the whole secret, was it not? That was the thing she had been circling all along. Some things, she understood, did not just let the warmth pass through them. Some things drank it in, held it, kept it like a secret, and gave it back slowly when everything else had gone cold. Her father would have had a word for it. He always had a word for the way a thing behaved. She did not have his word. So she made her own. A battery. That was the word that came to her, sitting alone by the dying fire. Not a thing that made warmth, but a thing that stored it. A reservoir. A deep, quiet well you filled when warmth was easy to come by, and drew from slowly through the long hours when it was not. She said it out loud to the empty room. A battery. And the word seemed to hang there in the firelight, warm and strange, and full of promise. Once she had the word, the rest of it came fast. If a wall could be made not just to slow the cold, but to hold the warmth, to store it like a deep well stores water, then the whole cruel fight would change. The fire would still burn through the evening, as every fire did. But instead of all that heat pouring straight through the wall and away into the night, some of it would be caught, soaked up, saved. And then, in the black hours when the fire sank to embers and the cold pressed hardest, the wall itself would give that warmth back, slowly, patiently, hour after hour, long after the flames had died. A wall that remembered the fire, a warm stone, the size of a whole house, tucked against the cold. She needed a material to do the holding. Something dense, something that would drink the heat in and give it back slow. Stone would do it, she knew. The flat creek rocks would do it beautifully, but stone was heavy beyond reason and scattered thin across that country, and no woman alone was going to haul enough of it to line a wall before the cold came down. So she sat with the problem. And the answer was so simple and so close that she nearly laughed when it finally came to her. Wood. The very thing they all fought over. The very thing they hauled and split and stacked and burned. It was not as good as stone, she suspected. A stone of the same size would hold more. But wood was everywhere. Wood she could lift and carry and stack with her own two hands, and dry wood, packed tight and thick, would drink the warmth and hold it and give it back, slow and faithful, through the longest night. Not wood to burn, wood to remember. She would build the warmth right into the walls of the house and let it stand guard while she slept. But she knew, even as the idea took hold of her, that it would have to be done right, carefully, or it would not work at all. Or worse, the wood could not be green. She understood that without being told. Green wood, fresh cut and full of sap, would sweat and rot the moment you shut it up tight in a wall. She had grown up in a workshop. She knew the difference between living wood and seasoned wood, the way some people know the difference between a friend and a stranger. So she chose only the driest she could find, and finding it meant going down to the breaks herself. She made the journey alone more than once through the long days of late summer, down across the rough miles to where the land finally dipped and the trees stood waiting. It was hard, lonely work, the kind that left her hands raw and her shoulders burning, and her whole body aching by the time she turned the wagon home in the failing light. But she did not mind it. There was something in the labor that quieted the grief, the swing of the axe, the clean smell of split wood, the slow, satisfying weight of a full wagon. Out there, with no one to watch and no one to wonder at her, she could let her father's lessons take over her hands, and for whole hours at a time, she would forget to be sad. She chose each piece the way he had taught her. Hardwood, dense and heavy in the hand. Wood that rang when you knocked two pieces together. A hard, clean note, not the dull thud of green timber. She passed over anything soft, anything damp, anything that showed the faintest gray bloom of rot. She hauled it home and stacked it in the sun and the wind, and let a whole long summer bake the moisture clear out of it. The neighbors saw her hauling wood through the summer and thought nothing of it. Everyone hauled wood. Hauling wood was the one thing everyone in that country understood. They had no idea, not yet, that she was not stacking it to burn. She was gathering a battery, piece by patient piece. When autumn came, she began to build. And building for her meant first taking apart. She went to the two worst walls of her little cabin, the long north wall and the long west wall, the two that stood square against the meanest of the winter wind. And she tore the inside of them open. It was hard work and lonely work, and she did all of it herself. She pried loose the rough inner boards one by one, the thin lining that every cabin in the settlement put up to hold back the drafts. She pulled the nails. She stacked the boards. She worked until her hands blistered and the blisters broke and healed into calluses. And then she worked some more. And when the inner lining was down, she set about making the space behind it deeper. This was the part no one would have understood had they seen it. The narrow gap behind the lining, the little hollow that other folks left as thin as they could to lose no precious room. She did the opposite. She pushed it back. She moved the framing out, away from the logs, until the hollow behind her two worst walls was not the width of a few fingers, but the width of a forearm. A deep, dark cavity running the whole length of both walls, floor to ceiling. It cost her room. There was no pretending otherwise. Her little cabin was already small, and now it was smaller, the walls reaching in toward the center, swallowing a strip of floor she could not spare. She stood in the middle of that shrunken room one evening and looked at what she had done, and a cold doubt moved through her. She had made her home smaller. She had torn open her own walls with winter coming on. If she was wrong, if her father's lessons and her own long nights of reasoning had led her astray, she would not just be cold this winter. She would be a woman who tore her own house apart for nothing, alone, with no one to blame but herself. She stood there a long moment in the gathering dark, and then she picked up the next board, and she kept working. Because she was not wrong. She had felt the cold leave through the logs with her own hand. She had watched the candle flame bend. She knew. And knowing was the one thing grief had given her that fear could not take back. She was not entirely alone in those weeks. Not quite. Reuben Stagg came by more than he would ever have admitted to. He never offered to help outright. That was not his way. But he had a habit of finding reasons to be near. A tool he thought she might want to borrow. A question about a fence line that did not really need asking. And somehow, while he was there, a heavy beam would get lifted that she could not have lifted alone. And then he would mutter something about the hour and be gone before she could thank him. One cold morning, he found her struggling to wrestle a long timber into place, and he stood watching for a moment with his arms crossed. "You know," he said slowly, "the whole settlement thinks you've lost your mind." She did not stop working. "And what do you think?" she asked. Reuben was quiet for a while. Then he stepped forward and took the other end of the timber without another word, and together they set it right. That was his answer. That was the whole of it. She understood him perfectly. There came an evening, near the end of a long day's work, when he lingered a little longer than usual. He stood in her doorway, turning his hat in his big hands, looking out at the dark coming down over the prairie, and for once he seemed in no hurry to leave. "My wife," he said after a while. He did not look at her when he said it. "She passed, some years back now." The widow went still. It was the first truly personal thing he had ever said to her. "This country," Reuben went on, his voice low and rough, "it takes folks. You learn not to say much about it. You just keep on." He set his hat on his head. "But I'll tell you this," he said, "a body gets tired of keeping on alone." And then he was gone, off into the dark toward his own cold house, before she could find a single word to say. She stood in the doorway a long time after, looking at the place where he had been. She had thought she was the only one out there carrying a grave around inside her. She had been wrong about that. It was around then that the Callaways came. They arrived late in the season, a young couple with a small child, and a wagon even more worn than hers had been, looking for a claim and a fresh start the way so many out there were. They took the patch of ground not far from her own, and their cabin was only half finished when the cold began to creep in at the edges of the days. The wife was named, well, it does not matter much what she was named. What matters is that she was kind. She was the first person in that whole guarded settlement to look at the widow at the edge of town and see, not a strange and broken woman muttering to her walls, but simply a neighbor, someone who might be lonely, someone who might know a thing or two about surviving out there. She came by with the child on her hip, and she did not ask what the widow was doing to her walls. She just sat and talked, and let the silence be easy. The child took to the widow at once, in the way small children do, without reason or caution. A bright, fearless little thing, all questions and quick small hands, forever wanting to know what this tool was for and why the wall was open and where the warmth went at night. "Where does it go?" the child asked her one afternoon, very serious, peering up into her face. "The warm, when the fire goes out. Where does it go?" And the widow had crouched down, so they were eye to eye, and considered the question as gravely as it had been asked. "That's just it, little one," she said softly. "It runs away, out through the walls, and up the chimney, off into the cold, where nobody can ever catch it again." The child frowned, thinking this over. "That's not fair," it declared at last. And the widow had laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, the first in longer than she could remember. No, she agreed. No, it isn't. But maybe we can teach the warm to stay. And something in the widow, some door that had been shut tight since the fever took everything, eased open. Just a crack. She had not held a child since her own life had fallen apart. She had not known how much she missed the small, warm weight of one, the trusting way they leaned into you, until the Calloway child fell asleep against her shoulder one afternoon while the grown folks talked. She sat very still so as not to wake the little one. And over the small, sleeping head, she met the young mother's eyes, and neither of them said anything at all. They did not need to. That was the first afternoon in a very long time that the widow had felt something other than cold inside her chest. But for every kindness, there were a dozen sharp tongues. Word of what she was doing got out. Of course it did. Word always gets out in a small and lonely place where there is little enough to talk about, and a strange woman tearing open her own walls is the finest entertainment in months. Reuben might have let something slip, or someone passing on the road might have looked through her open door and seen the deep, dark cavities and the stacks of dry wood waiting beside them. However it started, it spread. And as it spread, it changed. That is the way of a story passed mouth to mouth through a settlement. Each teller adds a little. Each listener forgets a little. And by the time it has gone all the way around, the truth has been worn down to something stranger and smaller and far more foolish than it ever was. By the time the tale had made its full circle, it had become this. The mad widow at the edge of town was stuffing her walls full of raw green firewood, and then sealing it all up behind boards and clay. Green wood, sealed in the walls. To anyone who knew the first thing about building, it sounded like madness. Worse than madness. It sounded dangerous. And the laughter started. She felt the full weight of it one afternoon at the store. She had come in for nails and a few small things, and the place was crowded, warm with the smell of the stove and the low rumble of talk. And the talk did not stop when she came in. It only changed. It dropped to that low, amused murmur she was coming to know so well, and she felt the eyes turn toward her and slide away and turn back. The sharp-eyed woman by the stove looked her up and down. "Heard you're keeping your firewood real handy this year," the woman said, and a little laughter ran around the room. "Right there in the walls with you." The widow set her things on the counter. "Handy enough," she said evenly. "They say come February, you'll be tearing it back out to burn it," another voice put in. "After all that work." "Foolish way to spend a summer," said someone else, not even bothering to lower his voice. "Woman alone ought to be laying in stores, not playing at building." The widow counted out her coins. She did not hurry. She did not let her hand shake. "Much obliged," she said to the man behind the counter, and she gathered her things, and she walked out into the cold with her head up and the laughter following her through the door. It was not until she was halfway home, alone on the empty road, that she let her shoulders fall. There goes the wood wall woman. Burning good lumber she'll be begging for come February. Tearing her own house down with winter at the door. She'll be the first one freezing. You mark it. She heard all of it, and she said nothing. That silence cost her more than anyone knew, because she was not a hard woman, whatever they thought. She had loved and lost, and crossed half a country alone, and arrived in this place with her heart already worn thin as old cloth. The laughter found the thin places. It always does. There were nights she lay awake and wondered if they were right. There were nights the doubt crept in along with the cold and whispered all the things the settlement whispered. That she was a foolish woman alone. That her grief had unmoored her. That she had spent her last good summer and her aching hands building a tomb for herself, while wiser folks built up their woodpiles and waited, smug, for her to fail. On the worst of those nights, she would press her palm flat against the half-built wall, the way her father had taught her, and she would go very still. And she would listen, not for a voice. The wood had no voice, but for the truth of it, the hard, clean, honest truth of how a thing holds itself up against the pull of the world. And the wall told her, in the only way a wall can, the same thing it had told her from the start. This will hold. She believed it. She had to believe it. It was all she had, so she let them laugh. She decided that the only argument worth making was not one she could speak. Words would never change a single mind in that settlement, and she knew it. They had made up their minds, the way tired people do, and no clever speech would move them. Only one thing would: the winter itself. She would let the winter make her argument for her, and until it came, she would keep her counsel and keep her dignity and keep building. That was the choice she made, alone, by the light of a single candle. She would not explain herself. She would simply be right. So she packed the walls. This was the heart of it. This was the work all the rest had only prepared her for, and she gave herself to it completely, through the shortening days and the lengthening cold, racing the season toward the first hard freeze. She did not just throw the wood in any old way. A careless pile would have proved every laughing tongue right. She built it the way her father built everything, with care and patience and respect for the thing taking shape under her hands. And as she worked, she thought of him. She thought of the slant of light through his workshop window and the curls of shavings around his boots, and his big hand laid over her small one on a rough plank. She thought of his voice, listened to it. Wood remembers everything that ever happened to it. She was teaching this wood to remember warmth. That was all. That was the whole of it. She was building her father's lesson into the bones of a house, and somehow, with her hands deep in the work, he felt nearer to her than he had in years. She chose each piece of that dry, seasoned hardwood. She laid them on their sides in the deep cavity, snug and level, the rough bark turned outward toward the cold logs, the clean split faces turned inward toward the warmth of the room. She cut them to length so they nearly filled the depth of the hollow, end to end, with hardly a gap to spare. She stacked them in tight, even rows, rising from the floor all the way to the ceiling, the whole long reach of both her worst walls. And where the pieces did not quite meet, where an uneven log left a small dark space, she packed it. Dry grass, gathered through the summer. Fine wood shavings, saved from her own work. She pressed it all down hard with her fingers until there was no loose air left. No hollow place for the cold to gather and creep. Hour after hour, day after day. Her shoulders burned. Her fingers cracked in the dry cold. Her back ached so that some nights she could barely straighten it. There was one night near the end when it nearly broke her. She had worked past dark, in the cold, until her hands would barely close. And the loneliness of it came down on her all at once, the way it sometimes did, sudden and total. The empty room, the empty country, the empty place in the bed beside her, where a warm hand used to reach for hers. She sat down on the floor among the stacked wood, and she put her face in her cracked, aching hands. And for a moment, just a moment, she let herself feel the whole weight of it, the dead husband, the miles of empty grass, the laughter in town, the terrible chance that she had it all wrong. But then she lifted her head, and she looked at the wall she had built, the dense, patient wood, row on row, climbing toward the ceiling in the candlelight. And she thought of a small body shivering in a doorway, learning to call its suffering ordinary. And she got up off the floor, and she kept working, because grief, she had learned, is not a thing you wait out. It is a thing you carry. And the only way she had ever found to carry it was to put it down into work that mattered. But row by row, the dark hollows in her walls grew solid, grew dense, grew heavy with all that patient, waiting wood. And she could feel it taking shape under her hands. She could feel the deadness of it, the wonderful, stubborn weight of it, the way it just sat there, refusing to be cold, refusing to be warm, holding itself in a great slow stillness, a battery filling, a well waiting to be drawn from. There was one thing she did that no one would have thought of, one small, clever thing, born of her workshop years and her long nights of reasoning. She did not pack the wood all the way against the inner boards. She left a gap, a narrow space, no wider than 2 fingers, running the whole height of the packed wall, between the dense wood and the inner lining she would put back up. A slim, unbroken channel on the warm side. The side that faced the heated room. She had thought hard about the danger the doubters whispered of, the danger of rot. She knew that even seasoned wood, shut up tight against the cold outer logs, might draw a little damp over time, as the warmth and cold of the seasons pulled the moisture this way and that. So she gave that damp a road to leave by. Through that narrow, warm channel, any moisture would rise, gently warmed by the room, and drift up and out through small openings she left at the very top of the wall. It would not gather. It would not pool and soak and rot the wood. It would simply leave. She did not explain this to anyone either. There was no one who would have listened. But she built it in, quietly, carefully. A small secret defense hidden in the bones of the wall against the very fear that the whole settlement was laughing about. She had answered their objection before they had even finished making it, and she had answered it, not with words, but with her hands. The last of the work was the closing up. She put the inner board lining back, fresh and clean over the deep, packed walls, hiding everything she had done behind a plain, ordinary face. And then she sealed it. She had made a mixture over the summer. Clay and grass fiber worked together, and she pressed it into every joint and seam with her thumbs until not a crack remained. She worked the edges smooth. She closed the house up tight so that the wind, when it came leaning against the logs, would find no road in, no gap, no whispering draft sliding low across the floor, where the wind had once poured through the walls of every house in that settlement. It would find in hers something very near to solid. And then, one cold evening, near the very end of autumn, with the light going gray and the first true bite of the season in the air. She pressed the last seam shut and stepped back and looked at what she had made. A stranger walking in just then would have seen nothing at all. That was the strangest thing about it. After all those weeks, after all that labor and all that laughter and all those aching nights, a person stepping through her door would have seen only a small, plain, ordinary room, walls of fresh boards, a little cast iron stove, a bed, a table, a chair. The room a touch smaller than most, perhaps, the walls reaching in a little closer than a stranger might expect, but nothing else, nothing strange, nothing to laugh at, and nothing to fear. Hidden behind those plain board walls, where no eye could see it, lay the work of her whole long autumn, a great dense mass of dry hardwood packed tight from floor to ceiling along the two coldest walls of the house. Tons of it, silent, waiting. A slow battery, full and ready. A well brimming, waiting to be drawn from through the long, dark months to come. She stood in the middle of her small, warm room and pressed her palm one last time against the wall, and she felt nothing under her hand but a deep, patient stillness, the stillness of something that was holding its breath. Outside, the light died and the cold came down, and far off across the open country, the wind began to stir. It moved low over the frozen grass, the way it always did, patient and certain, the way something moves when it knows it has all winter to win. It found the other cabins of the settlement, the ones with their wood piles stacked high and their owners smug and certain, and it leaned against their walls and began, slowly, to drink the warmth right out of them. And then it came at last to the small cabin at the edge of town, the one set apart behind the low rise of earth, the one the whole settlement had laughed about all autumn long. It leaned against her walls, and it found nothing to take. She did not see the wind do this. She was inside, by her small fire, in a room that was beginning, ever so slightly, to hold its warmth in a way no room of hers had held it since the gentlest man she ever knew was still alive. She did not know yet how well it would work, not for certain. The real test was still to come in the deep of the winter, on the cruelest nights the country could throw at her. And she did not know that the hardest doubt of all had not yet come to her door, that a man would come. A man the whole settlement trusted. A man with 15 winters of building in his hands, and good, sound reasons in his mouth. Reasons that would shake her in a way the careless laughter never had. But that was still ahead of her. For now, there was only the small warm room, and the silent waiting wall, and a widow who had stopped at last, fighting the wrong fight. She banked her fire low, lower than any other soul in that settlement would have dared, and for the first time in a very long time, she lay down in the deepening cold and was not afraid. The wall would remember, and the winter was coming to find out. The man who came to her door was not a cruel man. That was what made it so hard. If he had been one of the careless laughers from town, one of the tired souls who shook their heads and felt clever beside her, she could have let it roll off her the way she had let all the rest roll off. But Amos Whitfield was not that. Amos Whitfield had been building homes in that hard country for the better part of a lifetime. 15 winters, some said. More, said others. He had raised cabins that still stood straight while younger men's work sagged and split and surrendered to the wind. When something needed building right, it was Amos they sent for. When a roof failed or a wall went bad, it was Amos who knew why. There was not a family in that whole country that did not owe him something. A barn raised against a coming storm. A chimney set right so it would draw and not smoke. A door frame squared so true that the door still swung sweet and silent 10 winters on. When Amos Whitfield said a thing about a building, people did not argue. They nodded, and they did as he said, and their houses stood. The settlement trusted him the way people trust the ground under their feet. And so, when word reached him of the mad widow stuffing her walls with wood, he did not laugh. He frowned. And one cold gray morning, with the first real teeth of winter already in the air, he hitched his horse and rode out to the small cabin at the edge of town to see the foolishness for himself. She watched him come from her window. She knew who he was. Everyone knew who he was. And she felt her stomach tighten as the tall figure climbed down from the saddle and stood looking at her little house with the long, slow, measuring gaze of a man who had spent his life reading the bones of buildings. She opened the door before he could knock. "Mr. Whitfield," she said. He touched his hat. "Ma'am." There was a silence. The wind moved between them, cold and searching. "They tell me," he said at last, "you've done something to your walls." She held the door open wider. "Come and see for yourself." He spent a long time inside. He did not laugh. He did not scoff. He moved through her small room the way a doctor moves around a sick bed, quiet and grave and careful. And she stood back and let him work, and her heart beat hard the whole while. He laid his palm flat against the fresh inner boards, the same way her father used to, the same way she did. He tapped the surface with one knuckle and listened to the sound it gave back. He ran his fingers along the sealed seams. He crouched low and studied the base of the wall, and rose and studied the top. And then he stepped back into the middle of the room and was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle, almost apologetic. The voice of a man who does not enjoy bringing bad news, but who would think it a sin to stay silent and let harm come. "You've done careful work," he said. "I'll give you that. This is no slapdash thing. A person can see you know your way around a tool." She said nothing. She waited. "But I have to tell you, ma'am, and I take no pleasure in it." He let out a slow breath. "This wall is going to fail you, and it may do worse than fail." He laid it out for her, plain and reasoned, the way an honest man lays out a hard truth. The wood, he said, packed tight against the cold outer logs, with no air to move around it. That wood would draw damp. It could not help but draw damp. The warmth on one side and the bitter cold on the other would pull the moisture through the wall, and shut up tight as it was, that moisture would have nowhere to go. It would gather. It would soak into the packed wood, and within a season or two, maybe 3, the whole of it would begin to rot, quietly, out of sight, where no eye could catch it until it was far too late. "Rotten wood is no insulation at all," he said. "It's worse than nothing. And rot in a sealed wall, that's a sickness that spreads. It works away in the dark, behind the boards, where you can't see it, until one day the whole wall just goes. And by then, There's nothing to be done. She still said nothing, but something in her chest had gone very still, because he was not wrong to fear it. He was only wrong because he could not see the narrow, warm channel she had built in behind the boards, the slim road she had left for the damp to rise and leave by. He could not see it, because she had hidden it well, but he had named the very danger she had spent her long nights guarding against. And there was a strange and lonely ache in being warned, so gravely and so kindly, against a thing you had already beaten. Then he told her about the fire, and this was the worst fear. She could see it in his face. All that dry wood, he said quietly, packed in your walls, floor to ceiling, all down 2 sides of your house. He shook his head slowly. That's not a wall anymore, ma'am. That's fuel. That's a fire just waiting for a reason. One bad spark from your stovepipe, one crack in the flue, one ember where it shouldn't be, and it won't be a fire you can see and fight. It'll start inside the wall, in the dark, in all that dry tinder. He looked at her, and there was real fear in his eyes. Not for himself, for her. You won't even know it's coming, he said. Not till it's too late. By the time you smell the smoke, the fire's already inside the wall, all around you, and there's no putting that out. There's only getting clear of it if you're quick and lucky. He let that sit in the cold air between them. You'd be sleeping, he said, softer still, with the whole thing wrapped around you. She heard him out to the very end. She did not interrupt. She did not argue. And when he was done, she did a thing that surprised him. She thanked him. She poured him a cup of coffee from the pot on her stove, and she set it in his rough hands, and she thanked him for riding all that way in the cold to tell her something he plainly did not enjoy telling. He looked at her, puzzled. He had expected tears, maybe, or anger, or the stubborn, foolish defiance of a woman too proud to admit she'd been beaten by her own bad idea. He had not expected this. Quiet. This calm. This strange, settled stillness, like the stillness of someone who knows something she is not saying. You're not going to tear it out, he said. It was not quite a question. She wrapped her own hands around her cup and looked into it for a while. No, she said. Ma'am. You came here to warn me, she said gently, and you were right to. Everything you said, a person ought to fear, and I thank you for it. I do. She lifted her eyes to his. But I'm going to let the winter have its say. He rode away, shaking his head. And the settlement, when it learned that even Amos Whitfield had come away from that cabin shaking his head, took it as the final word. If Amos said the wall would fail, then the wall would fail. That was simply how it was. Some of the laughter after that grew quieter, almost pitying. The woman was not just foolish now. She was doomed, and too proud to know it. And there is a particular kind of sorrow people reserve for someone they have decided is past saving. She felt that pity when she went to town. It was almost worse than the laughter. But she carried it the way she carried everything else, and after the sound of his horse had faded into the wind, the widow stood alone in her small room for a long, long while. Because here was the truth she had not spoken to him. His doubt had reached her in a way none of the laughter ever had. The careless tongues in town she could brush aside. They knew nothing. They were only frightened people glad to feel clever. But Amos Whitfield knew. He had a lifetime of hard-won knowing in those calloused hands. And when a man like that looked at your work and told you gently that it would fail, it shook something loose inside you, no matter how sure you had been. For the rest of that day, the old doubt crept back in along the cold seams of the room. What if she had missed something? What if all her long nights of reasoning had led her, in the end, into a beautiful and deadly mistake? But she did not reach for the wall this time. She reached for the work itself. One by one, she took up his fears and turned them over in the lamplight, the way her father had taught her to turn a doubtful board toward the window. The rot? She had given the damp a road to leave by. That narrow, warm channel he had not seen, could not have seen, hidden on the inner face where the heat would carry the moisture up and out. The fire? The wood was bone dry, packed solid, set far from any flame. No closer to catching than the boards of any other cabin in the settlement. He had named every danger, and she had answered every one, quietly, in the autumn. Long before he ever rode out to fear them aloud, she let out a long, slow breath. He had not been wrong to worry. He had only been a season too late. She trusted the work, and she settled in to wait for the winter to prove what no argument ever could. She did not have long to wait. The cold that came down on that country that year was a cold beyond the memory of even the oldest among them. It did not arrive gently. It came the way the hardest things come, all at once, without warning and without mercy. One day the ground was merely frozen. The next, the very air had teeth. The wind that had only leaned before now drove hard across the open plain, flinging the snow sideways in long white sheets, turning the short walk between one cabin and the next into something a person could die in. And the cold settled in, and stayed, and deepened. It was the kind of winter that takes things. Out in the settlement, the careful plans began to fail. The families had stacked their wood piles by the old reckoning, by the measure of winters past. But this was no winter past. This was something hungrier. And by the deep of the season, the great stacks of wood that had seemed so comfortably high in autumn had shrunk to something that made strong men stand and stare, and feel the first cold touch of fear. They burned more, and it was not enough. They burned through the day and through the night, feeding their open hearths and their iron stoves as fast as their arms could move, and still the cold came through the walls. Still it crept low across the floors. Still, in the black hours before dawn, the warmth poured up the chimneys and out through the cracks and away into the howling dark, faster than any fire could make it. Inside their cabins, water left standing too near a wall grew a skin of ice by morning. Children were moved to pallets right beside the stoves. Coats were worn indoors, day and night, and in cabin after cabin, all across that frozen country, someone had to rise every few hours through the long nights and stumble to the fire and feed it again, and again, and again, or wake to find the cold had crept too close to bear. The sharp-eyed woman from the store, the one who had laughed loudest at the wood-wall woman, sent her own children out in the worst of it to scratch up what fuel they could from the frozen breaks, twigs, deadfall, anything that would burn. They came back with their hands cracked and bleeding and barely enough to last the night. There was no laughter left in anyone now. There was only the cold and the dwindling wood, and the long arithmetic of how many days of warmth still stood between a family and the killing dark. This was the winter they had all made their peace with. This was just what winter meant. Except in one small cabin at the edge of town. There, behind the low rise of earth, behind the plain board walls, the whole settlement had laughed at all autumn long. Something different was happening. There, the widow had banked her small fire low, lower than any other soul in that country would have dared. And she had gone to her bed, and she had slept all through the night, without rising once to feed the flames. And she had woken warm, for all through the burning hours of the evening, while her modest fire gave off its modest heat, the great dense mass of wood packed into her walls had been drinking that warmth in, slowly, patiently, hour after hour, soaking up the heat the way dry ground soaks up a gentle rain, asking nothing, taking it in and holding it. And then, in the deep of the night, when the fire had sunk to a soft red glow, the wall had begun, just as slowly, to give it back. Hour after hour, through the worst of the cold, the warmth crept back out of that packed wood and into the room, not in a rush, not all at once, but faithfully, steadily, the way you draw water, slow and even, from a deep, full well. While every other cabin in the settlement plunged toward bitter cold by dawn, hers slipped only gently down, from warm to merely cool, and held there, comfortable and safe, until morning. She burned, through those long weeks, scarcely half the wood her neighbors burned. Less, on some nights. She had built the warmth right into her walls in the autumn, and now, in the deep of the winter, the walls were giving it back. The wall remembered the fire, just as she had said it would. Reuben Stagg was the first to truly understand. He came stamping through the snow one bitter morning, half frozen, his own woodpile dwindling fast, and the moment he stepped through her door, he stopped dead. He had expected the same desperate cold he fought in his own house, the same shivering struggle. Instead, he found a room so warm he had to loosen his coat. He stood there in the doorway with the snow melting off his shoulders, staring around the small bright room, and then at the widow, who was sitting calmly at her table with her hands wrapped around a cup as if it were any ordinary morning. "It's warm in here," he said. It came out almost as an accusation, as if warmth in that winter, in that country, were a thing too strange to be true. She rose and poured him a cup and pressed it into his cold hands. "It is," she said simply. He looked at the plain board walls, the walls he had helped her raise, the walls everyone had laughed at. And something moved across his hard face, slow as a thaw. He did not say it. Reuben Stagg was not a man for saying things, but she saw it there, plain as day. He understood now. She had been right all along. He stayed longer than he needed to that morning. He warmed his hands. He drank his coffee slow. And when at last he rose to go back out into the cold, he paused at the door, and he looked at her. And there was something in his face she had not seen there before. It was not pity. The whole settlement had been giving her pity for months. It was something closer to wonder. "You knew," he said, "all along, while they were laughing, you knew." She only smiled a little and did not answer, but she carried that look of his with her through the rest of that bitter day. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at her like she was someone worth wondering at, like she was someone at all. But the winter was not finished with them. The worst of it came on the cruelest night of all. It had been building for days, a heaviness in the sky, a stillness in the air that the old-timers had learned to dread more than any wind because they knew what that stillness meant. It meant the country was gathering itself. It meant something was coming that would make everything before it seem like a mild and gentle thing. And then, at dusk, it came. The wind rose to a scream that the oldest among them would speak of for years after, a wind that seemed to come from the very edge of the world, driving the snow so thick that a person could barely see their own hand held out before them. The cold fell past anything that had a name. The whole settlement shut itself behind its doors and huddled at its fires and prayed for the dawn. And out on the half-finished claim not far from the widow's, in a cabin still raw and unsealed against the cold, the Callaways were in trouble. Their wood was gone. They had burned through the last of it, fighting that terrible night. And now there was nothing left to feed the dying fire, and the cold was coming through their poor unfinished walls like water through a broken dam. And the child, the bright, fearless little one who had fallen asleep against the widow's shoulder in the warm days of autumn, who had asked her so solemnly where the warm went when the fire died. The child had taken a fever, a high, frightening fever, the kind that burns hot in a small body and then is followed by the killing cold, the kind that, in a cabin with no fire and no wood and a screaming wind clawing at the walls, could take a little life before morning. The young mother held the child and wept and did not know what to do. And the young father stood at the door looking out into the white, roaring dark, knowing that to go out into it was to risk dying in it, and knowing that to stay was to watch his child slip away. It was Reuben who came. He had been at his own window for hours, sleepless, his thoughts running on his dwindling wood and his cold house, and somehow, again and again, on the young family on the raw new claim with the half-built walls and the small child inside. He had kept his eyes turned that way through the worst of it, toward the one faint smudge of firelight he could still make out, far off, across the white. And when that single warm point he had been holding in his sight simply guttered and died into the storm, when the last light in that direction went black, he knew. He did not stop to think. There was no time for thinking. He wrapped himself against the cold, and he went out into that screaming dark, into a storm a wise man would never have entered. And he fought his way across the snow to the Callaway's door. The crossing nearly killed him. The wind came at him sideways, knocking him off his feet, filling his mouth and his eyes with snow, stealing the breath right out of his chest. More than once he lost all sense of which way he was going, turned around in a world that had become nothing but white and roar and stinging cold. He kept his head down and his shoulder to the wind, and he counted his steps, and he prayed, and somehow, his outstretched hands struck the rough logs of the Callaway's wall. And when he hammered through their door and saw the child, burning with fever in a freezing room, the young parents frantic and helpless, the last of their fire gone gray, he made the only choice there was to make. "There's one house still warm," he shouted over the wind. "One house, in this whole settlement. Get the child, and come." The young father stared at him. "We'll never make it. Not in that." "You'll die for certain if you stay," Reuben said. "Now wrap that child up and follow me close. Hold to my coat and do not let go. Do you hear me? Whatever happens, do not let go." And he led them out into the storm. 3 grown souls and 1 small burning child, fighting through the white roaring dark, half blind, half frozen, stumbling and falling, and dragging one another up again, clinging to the back of Reuben Stagg's coat as he forced a path through snow that came to their knees, then their thighs, the wind trying with all its strength to scatter them and swallow them and bury them where they fell. They could not see the cabin. They could not see anything. They went on faith, and on Reuben's stubborn counting of steps, toward the one place in all that frozen country where the warmth had not died, toward the small cabin at the edge of town, toward the house everyone had laughed at. The widow heard the pounding on her door over the scream of the wind. She threw it open, and they fell in out of the storm in a tangle of snow and terror, and she took one look at the burning, shivering child in the young mother's arms, and the whole world fell away. Because she had been here before. She had knelt before, in another winter, in another life, beside another body that the cold was reaching for. She had fed a fire that could not save what mattered. She had broken a chair apart in the dark and watched the warmth pour away into the night and been unable to keep the one she loved. She knew this cold. She knew exactly what it wanted. And this time, she was ready for it. "Give the child to me," she said, and her voice did not shake. She took the small burning body into her arms, and she carried it to the warmest corner of her small warm room, the corner against the great packed wall where the stored warmth of a dozen burning evenings was even now seeping gently back into the world. She wrapped the child in every blanket she owned. She pressed cool cloths to the small hot forehead and warm ones to the small cold hands. She held the little one against her, against the wall that remembered the fire, and she did not let go. She sat there all through that terrible night, while the storm screamed against the house and found no way in. While the young parents huddled close, warming at last, their violent shivering slowly easing, weeping with a fear that turned hour by hour into something that dared to call itself hope. While Reuben sat by the low-banked fire that did not need feeding, watching the strange wonder of a room that simply stayed warm, the young mother could not stop staring at the walls. "How is it so warm?" she whispered once into the dark. "There's hardly any fire at all." "Hush now," the widow said gently. "Tend your husband. Let me tend the little one." And she bent again over the child. She talked to it, low and steady, through the worst of the hours. Nonsense mostly. The kind of soft, wandering talk you give a frightened creature to let it know it is not alone. She told it about her father's workshop, and the smell of fresh-cut pine, and the way the shavings curled like pale snow that never melted. She told it that the warm had not run away this time, that she had caught it, that she had built it a place to stay, right here in these walls, and it was not going anywhere. And neither was the child. Not tonight, not while she had breath in her body. She held the child through the darkest hours, when fevers do their worst, when the cold presses hardest and small lives hang by a thread, and the wall he held them all. Hour after hour, through the very worst of that endless night, the warmth crept out of the packed wood and into the room and into the small fighting body in her arms. The warmth she had built into the walls in the lonely autumn, the warmth the whole settlement had laughed at her for, the warmth that no fire in any other cabin in all that frozen country could have kept alive that night. It kept the child alive. She felt the fever crest and break, and the small body shudder and then ease. She felt the wild heat give way at last to a quiet, even warmth. She felt the little one settle against her, deep into the safe, exhausted sleep of a child whose body has won its fight. And somewhere in those dark hours, with the child finally sleeping safe against her, and the wall giving back its patient warmth all around them, something inside the widow that had been frozen for a very long time finally, gently, began to thaw. She had not been able to save the gentlest man she ever knew, but she had not failed because she had not loved enough, or tried hard enough, or knelt long enough by the fire. She had only been fighting the wrong fight. And now, at last, in the deep of the cruelest night that country had ever known, she had won the right one. The dawn came slow and pale and silent. The wind died some time before morning, the way even the worst storms must, and when the first gray light crept across the snow, it crept into a small warm cabin where a young family slept safe, and a hard-faced neighbor dozed by a low, untended fire, and a child breathed soft and easy in the arms of the woman they had all called mad. The little one stirred and opened two clear eyes and looked up at the widow's tired face and smiled. "You caught the warm," the child whispered, remembering. "You caught it. It stayed." And the widow, who had not wept in longer than she could remember, who had done all her crying years ago in a house full of cold ash, felt her eyes fill at last. "Yes," she said softly. "Yes, little one. It stayed." The fever was gone. The child would live. And outside, all across that frozen country, the settlement was waking to the bitter morning, not yet knowing that everything they believed about that small cabin and the strange, quiet woman who lived in it was about to change forever. The morning the storm broke, the whole settlement went still. It was the kind of stillness that comes after a great violence has passed, when the wind has finally screamed itself out, and the snow lies deep and blue and unbroken in the first pale light, and the world seems to hold its breath, surprised to find itself alive. One by one, the doors of the little cabins opened. One by one, people stepped out into the cold and bright and frozen morning, stamping their feet, breathing in clouds, looking around at a country buried whole under the worst night any of them could remember. And as they dug themselves out, the news began to move from house to house, the way news moves in a small and lonely place, carried on cold breath, passed from one stunned face to the next. The Calloway's fire had gone out in the night. The child had taken a fever. And in the deep of that killing storm, with their own wood gone and the cold pouring in, the young family had fled across the snow to the one house in all the settlement where the warmth had not died. The house at the edge of town. The house they had all laughed at. By the time the sun was fully up, half the settlement had heard it, and the other half soon would. The mad widow's wall of wood, the foolish thing, the dangerous thing, the wasteful thing they had all shaken their heads over through the autumn, had stayed warm through the cruelest night that country had ever thrown down. It had stayed warm with hardly any fire at all, and it had kept a sick child alive when no other cabin in the settlement could have. People stood in their dooryards and looked off toward the low rise of earth at the far edge of town, where a thin, sweet thread of smoke rose from a single chimney into the still blue air. And for the first time, they did not laugh. The sharp-eyed woman from the store stood longest of all, looking off toward that distant chimney, her own children pale and pinched with cold behind her. And whatever it was she felt in that moment, she never spoke of it. But she never laughed at the wood wall woman again. Inside the small warm cabin, the young family slept on. The widow did not wake them. She let them sleep, the deep healing sleep of people who have come through a terrible thing. The parents tangled close together, the child breathing soft and even between them. The fever gone, the small face peaceful at last. She moved quietly about the room. She fed her fire just a little. She set water to warm. And she stood for a while at the window, watching the sun come up over all that buried country, with a stillness in her chest she had not felt in years. She had sat awake the whole night, and she was bone-tired, tired all the way through. And yet, she felt lighter than she had felt since the day she buried the gentlest man she ever knew, because something had shifted in those dark hours. The thing she had carried west across all those empty miles, the stones sewn into the lining of her heart, the guilt and the grief and the terrible certainty that she had somehow failed the one she loved. It had loosened in the night. She had not failed because she lacked love. She knew that now. Knew it in her bones, the way she knew the grain of wood. She had simply not known how. No one had. The whole world had been fighting the cold the wrong way. And she had paid the price for it, the way so many had. But she knew how now. And in the deep of the night, she had used that knowing to do the one thing she had not been able to do before. She had kept someone warm. She had kept someone alive. Reuben Stagg woke from his doze by the fire and found her standing at the window in the morning light. And for a while, he just watched her, not speaking. Then he rose, stiff and quiet, and came to stand beside her. "They'll know now," he said softly. "The whole settlement. They'll know what you did." She kept her eyes on the sunrise. "It wasn't me," she said. "It was the wall." Reuben let out a low sound that might almost have been a laugh. "The wall," he said, "that everyone but you said was madness." She did not answer that, but the smallest smile touched the corner of her mouth, and the two of them stood there together in the warm, quiet room, watching the light come up over the snow, while a young family and a healing child slept safe behind them. The thaw came late that year, as it always does after a winter like that one. But it came. The snow began to soften. The creek began to murmur again under its skin of ice. The hard land breathed out, slow and grudging, and the first green threads pushed up through the brown dead grass, and the country remembered, the way it always did, how to be alive. And one of the first to come to the widow's door, when the roads were clear enough to ride, was Amos Whitfield. She saw him coming from her window, just as she had the first time. The same tall figure, the same slow measuring way of writing. But there was something different in him now, something she could not name until he was off his horse and standing at her door with his hat already in his hands. He looked uncertain. Amos Whitfield, who had been building homes in that country for the better part of a lifetime, who knew the bones of buildings the way other men knew their own names, stood at her door looking like a man who has come to say a hard thing and means to say it right. She opened the door before he could knock. "Mr. Whitfield." "Ma'am." He turned the hat slowly in his hands. "I heard what happened in the storm. The Calloway child." She nodded. He was quiet a moment. "I came to ask," he said at last, "if you'd let me see the wall." She had thought about this. All through the long weeks of winter, somewhere in the back of her mind, she had known this day might come. And so, when she had closed up the walls in the autumn, she had done one small, careful thing she had told no one. She had made a section of the inner lining so that it could be taken down again. A panel, fitted neat and clean, that a person could lift away to see what lay behind. She had built it, perhaps, for exactly this. She led Amos Whitfield to the long north wall, and she lifted the panel away, and she stepped back and let him look. He looked for a long time. He looked at the dense, tight-packed rows of dry hardwood, stacked clean from floor to ceiling, just as she had laid them in the cold weeks of autumn. He reached in and laid his rough hand against the wood. He pressed. He felt along the pieces, turning them where he could, searching for the damp he had warned her of, the rot he had been so sure of, the gray bloom of decay that should have been creeping through all that sealed up wood by now, in the dark, where no eye could catch it. He found none. The wood was dry, clean, sound, exactly as it had been the day she laid it in. He stood there with his hand against it, and he was very quiet. "How?" he said finally. His voice was low. "How did you keep the damp out of it? Packed in tight like this, against the cold logs. It should have sweated. It should have rotted. I'd have staked my name on it." She came and stood beside him at the open wall, and then she showed him. She showed him the narrow channel she had left, no wider than 2 fingers, running the whole height of the wall on the warm inner side. The slim, quiet road for the damp to rise by, gently warmed by the room, and drift up and out through the small openings she had left at the very top. She showed him how she had chosen only the driest wood, baked clear through by a whole long summer of sun and wind. How she had packed it so tight there was scarcely room for the cold to creep. How every piece had been considered, the way her father had taught her to consider a board, with her palm flat against the grain. She explained it plainly, without pride and without apology, the way one builder speaks to another. And Amos Whitfield listened. He did not interrupt. He did not argue. He listened the way a man listens when he has come, at last, not to teach, but to learn. And when she was done, he asked her questions. Good questions. Sharp questions. The kind of questions a man asks, not because he is looking for a flaw, but because he wants, with his whole heart, to understand. She answered every one. When the last question had been asked and answered, Amos Whitfield stepped back from the wall and was silent for a long moment. Then he set his hat down on her table, and he turned to face her, and he did a thing that no one in that whole hard country had ever seen Amos Whitfield do. He admitted he had been wrong. He did not say it in those exact words. He was too proud a man, and too old a one, for the words to come easy. But he said enough. He said that he had built houses in that country for the better part of his life, and had thought there was nothing left for him to learn about keeping the cold out, and that he had been mistaken. He said that she had seen a thing the rest of them had been too sure of themselves to see. He said it slow and grave, and with a respect that was deeper than any apology, because it was the respect of a master craftsman for work that had bettered his own. "I came out here in the fall," he said, "to warn a foolish woman away from a foolish thing." He shook his head slowly. "And it turns out, the only fool was the one standing in your cabin telling you so." She might have been forgiven in that moment for some small triumph, for some quiet, well-earned satisfaction at hearing the most respected builder in all that country stand in her small cabin and call himself the fool. But she felt none. She only felt a kind of gentle ease, the way you feel when a thing that has been carried too long is finally, quietly, set down. "You weren't a fool," she said. "You feared the right things. Anyone who knew building would have feared them." She looked at the wall. "The only difference," she said softly, "is that I'd already lost everything I had to the cold, once before, and it left me no choice but to think a great while longer about it than a person with a warm house ever would." Amos Whitfield looked at her for a long moment, and something passed between them then. Two people who knew the bones of things, two people who had spent their lives in honest work with their hands, something that was not quite friendship, not yet, but was the deep, clean respect from which friendship grows. He picked up his hat. He turned to go. At the door, he paused. "There's 3 families I know of," he said, "still digging out from this winter, swearing they won't live through another like it." He looked back at her. "Would you mind if I told them what you did? Showed them, maybe? With your blessing and your guiding?" The widow stood very still. And then she smiled. A real smile. The first full real smile to cross her face in longer than she could say. "I'd be glad of it," she said. And so it spread. Not all at once, not in any grand way. It spread the way the best things spread in a small and lonely country, from one hand to the next, from one neighbor to another. Quietly, patiently, the way warmth itself spreads through a cold room. That very spring, Reuben Stagg tore open the worst walls of his own cabin and built them anew. He did it her way, with her standing by to guide him, the two of them working side by side through the long, mild days. But Reuben, being Reuben, could not leave a thing entirely alone, and he packed his walls not only with dry wood, but with flat, smooth stones he hauled up from the creek, reasoning that stone might hold the warmth even longer than wood. And he was not wrong. His cabin, the next winter, was warmer than his old one had ever dreamed of being, and burned barely a third of the wood. He was insufferably proud of those stones. She let him be. There was an ease between them now that had not been there before. Working side by side through those long, bright days, passing tools without a word, sharing the silence the way two people do who have each learned to live with a grave inside them. Some afternoons they hardly spoke at all, Some afternoons they spoke of everything, and one evening, with the work done and the light going long and gold across the grass, Reuben set down his tools and looked at her for a while. "It's a strange thing," he said slowly. "A body gets so used to being alone, it forgets there was ever any other way." She knew what he was trying to say. She had known for a while. "It does," she agreed quietly. "But a wall," he said, working the words out careful as a man fitting a joint. "A wall holds the warmth better when there's something inside it. You taught me that." He looked down at his big, rough hands. "Reckon a house might be the same." It was not a speech. It was not a grand thing. It was about as much as a man like Reuben Stagg would ever manage to say out loud. But the widow understood him perfectly. She always had. And she found, to her own quiet surprise, that the thought of not being alone anymore did not frighten her the way she had once thought it would. The Callaways were next. Their cabin was still only half finished, and that, it turned out, was a gift. For they did not have to tear anything open and build it over the hard way, the way the widow had. They could build it right from the very start. She helped them. Of course, she helped them. She spent days on that raw new claim, showing the young couple how to deepen their walls, how to choose and dry and pack the wood, how to leave the narrow, warm channel for the damp to escape by. The young father worked and learned, and the young mother worked beside him with the child never far off. And the child, the bright, fearless little one who had burned with fever in the widow's arms through the cruelest night, and woken to smile up at her in the dawn, the child followed her everywhere, wanting to know what every tool was for, wanting to hand her things, wanting to press a small palm flat against the wood the way she did, and go very still, and listen the way she did, and pretend to understand whatever it was she was listening for. "What's it say?" the child would ask, palm pressed to the grain, brow furrowed with effort. "What's the wood saying?" "Listen close," the widow would tell it, smiling. "Listen close, and it'll tell you which way it grew, where it's strong, what it remembers." She taught the little one to listen to the wood, just as her father had once taught her, and every time that small hand pressed flat against the grain, and that small face went solemn and still with concentration, something in the widow's chest, some old frozen thing, melted a little further toward spring. The young mother saw it. Mothers see these things. She watched the way the widow's whole face changed when the child ran to her. She watched the gentleness in those careful hands. She watched a woman who had come to that country with nothing but grief and a wagon load of tools, slowly, season by season, becoming something other than alone. And one warm evening, with the work done for the day and the light going gold across the new green grass, the young mother said a thing the widow would carry with her always. "You know," she said, watching her child chase fireflies in the long dusk, "we used to be afraid of this country, afraid of the winters, afraid we'd made a terrible mistake, coming out here with nothing." She turned and looked at the widow. "We're not afraid anymore," she said simply, "because of you." The widow opened her mouth to say it was nothing, to say it was only the wall, to deflect it the way she deflected everything. But the young mother shook her head gently before the words could come. "Not the wall," she said. "You." And the widow found she had nothing to say to that at all. She only stood there in the gold evening light, with a fullness in her chest that she had no name for, and watched a child she loved chase fireflies through the grass. Other families came after that, a household here, a household there, as word spread and the memory of that terrible winter stayed sharp in everyone's mind. They came to her not with laughter now, but with hats in their hands and questions on their lips, the way Amos Whitfield had come. And she helped every one of them. She never asked for anything in return. She had no use for thanks, and even less for praise. But she gave her knowledge freely, the way her father had given his, holding nothing back, glad to see a thing she had reasoned out alone in the dark take root and grow and keep other people's children warm. She remembered once an old farmer who had been among the loudest of the laughers, standing on her doorstep with his hat crushed in his hands, unable to look her in the eye. He had come to ask for her help with his walls, and the asking was costing him more pride than he had to spare. She did not make him say he was sorry. She did not make him say anything at all. She just put on her coat and got her tools and went to help him build. That was the kind of woman she was. The cold had taken a great deal from her, but it had never once managed to take that. She walked their claims. She laid her palm against their walls. She showed them how to listen, and one by one, the cabins of that lonely settlement changed. The smoke that poured so desperately from their chimneys in winters past began to thin and gentle and ease, as house after house learned to hold its own warmth and stopped pouring it away into the empty sky. The whole country grew a little warmer and a little less afraid. The work changed her too. That was the thing. Helping all those families, walking all those claims, being needed and wanted and welcomed in homes that had once whispered about her behind her back. It did something to a woman who had spent so long believing she had nothing left to give. She had come to that country to disappear, to go somewhere far and empty and quiet, where the grief could not find her, and simply endure. And instead, without ever meaning to, she had built herself a place in the world. Not just a warm house, a place. A web of small connections, thin at first as the first green threads of spring, and then stronger and stronger. A neighbor who took the other end of a heavy timber without being asked. A young family who had stopped being afraid because of her. A child who ran to her across the grass. A proud old builder who had become, somewhere along the way, a true friend. She had not set out to heal. But warmth, it turns out, is not a thing you can give away without keeping a little for yourself. And season by season, almost without her noticing, the frozen thing inside her thawed all the way through. The years went on, the way years do. The settlement grew, new families came, and old ones put down deeper roots, and the rough scattering of cabins became, slowly, something more like a real and living place. A church, in time, a school, a proper road where there had only ever been a rutted track. Children were born who had never known a winter spent shivering by a dying fire, never known the terror of a fever in a freezing room, because by the time they came along, every house that mattered had learned to keep its warmth. They never knew to wonder why. That was the way of it, the way of all the quiet, good things people do for one another. The children warm in their beds did not know, and would never know, that there had once been a woman who came to that country broken and alone, and who had stood in the cold and the laughter and figured out, all by herself, how to keep the warmth from leaving. The exact telling of it faded, the way such things fade. In time, even the older folk grew hazy on the details. Some said it had been one woman. Some said it had always been the way they built out there. The story softened and blurred and settled down into the bones of the place. The way her father's careful joinery settled into the bones of a house, holding everything up long after anyone remembered whose hands had made it. Her name, such as it was, drifted slowly out of the telling. But here is the thing that made her ending different from the lonely fading away it might so easily have been. She was not forgotten by the ones who mattered. The Calloway child grew up and grew old, and never once forgot the woman who had held a small burning body through the cruelest night and willed it back to life. Never forgot the warm room, the soft wandering voice in the dark, the gentle hands. Never forgot being told that the worm had not run away this time, that someone had caught it, had built it a place to stay. That child carried the memory of her like a warm coal in the heart all the long years and passed it on, not as a fact in a story, but as something far better, as a way of being in the world. That child grew up to be the kind of person who notices the lonely ones at the edge of things, the kind who takes the other end of a heavy load without being asked, the kind who looks at a problem everyone else has given up on and tilts their head and wonders, what if we've all been thinking about this the wrong way? That was her true legacy. Not the walls, not the wood, not the clever trick of holding warmth, though that too lived on, quietly, in house after house for generations. Her true legacy was the warmth she had put into people, and that kind of warmth, once it gets into the world, it never really leaves. It only passes on, from one heart to the next, from one hand to another, the way warmth always spreads through a cold room, slowly, patiently, faithfully. She lived out her years in that country she had come to in order to disappear, and she did not disappear at all. She grew old in a small, warm house at the edge of a town that had learned, in the end, to love her. She had her neighbor, who became something more than a neighbor in the long, quiet evenings. Two solitary souls who had found, late and unlooked for, the simple comfort of not being alone. There was no grand romance to it, nothing a young heart would recognize. Just a hand to hold across a table, a second chair by the fire that was no longer empty, a voice in the house that was not her own. After so many years of carrying her grief alone, it turned out to be enough. It turned out to be more than enough. She had a family that was not hers by blood, but was hers in every way that counts. She had a child to teach, and then that child's children, and a whole long line of small hands she taught to press flat against the wood and go still and listen. She had, in the end, the one thing she had stopped believing she would ever have again: a home. Not just walls that held the warmth. A home. On the last winter of her long life, so the story goes, there came a night of deep and bitter cold. The wind moved low across the open country, the way it always had, patient and certain, leaning against the walls of the sleeping town. And in a small, warm house at the edge of things, an old woman sat by a low-banked fire that did not need feeding, in a room that held its warmth through the dark, the way it always had, the way she had taught it to, so many years before. She was not afraid of the cold anymore. She had not been afraid of it for a very long time. She sat in the deep, quiet warmth of the home she had built, surrounded by the gentle ghosts of everything she had lost and everyone she had loved, and all the long good years she had never once expected to have. And she pressed her palm one last time, flat against the wall, and she went very still. And she listened, and the wall told her, in the only way a wall can tell anything, the same thing it had always told her: you are warm, you are safe, you are home. Far off across the sleeping country, the wind still moved low over the frozen grass, the way it always had. It leaned against house after house, and found them warm. It found nothing to take. If a traveler had crossed the ridge that night, he might have looked down on all those soft amber windows, glowing one after another in the dark, and wondered how a whole town in such a cruel and empty country had ever learned to stay so warm. He would never have guessed the answer: that it began with one woman. One quiet, broken, stubborn woman who came to that country with nothing but her grief and a wagon load of tools, and who, instead of fighting the cold the way everyone always had, taught the walls to remember the fire. And somewhere in the warm and sleeping dark, that gentle amber light went on glowing, the way it always had, the way, because of her, it always would.